The first time my husband introduced me to a new client, he called me the office decoration. We were in the lobby of our Chicago headquarters, the one with the green marble floor my mother had picked out 23 years ago, and he laughed when he said it. The client laughed too. I laughed because that's what you do when your husband makes a joke at your expense in front of someone holding a checkbook. My name didn't come up. Not my actual title. Not the fact that the building we were standing in had my mother's initials carved into the cornerstone outside. I poured the coffee. That was 4 years into our marriage. I want to start there because people keep asking me in the comments and the messages and the late-night emails from women who recognize themselves in my story, when did you know? And the honest answer is, I knew that morning. I just didn't admit it to myself for another 18 months. Let me back up. My mother started Brennick Logistics out of the second bedroom of a duplex in Evanston in 1986. She was 31, divorced, with a 4-year-old me sleeping in the room next door while she made cold calls about freight forwarding. By the time I was in middle school, we'd moved into a house she paid for in cash. By the time I graduated from Northwestern with a degree in supply chain management, the company had 240 employees and contracts with 3 of the top 10 retailers in the country. She made me earn every promotion. I started in the warehouse scanning pallets at 5 in the morning and worked my way up over 12 years until she made me Chief Operating Officer. She died of pancreatic cancer the spring I turned 33. The diagnosis came in February and we buried her in May. In her will, she left me 100% of the voting shares of Brennick Logistics. The non-voting shares she split between a few long-time employees and a foundation she'd set up for women starting their own businesses. I want to be clear about this part because the comments under stories like mine always ask why a woman would let a man take over her company. I didn't. The legal ownership never moved. My name was on every founding document, every shareholder agreement, every line of the operating bylaws. What I did was something quieter and, in retrospect, much stupider. I let my husband become the face. His name is Marshall. We met at a logistics conference in Atlanta the year before my mother got sick. He was a regional sales director at a competitor. Charming in the way that people who've been told they're charming since age 15 are charming, with a Tennessee accent he could turn on and off depending on who he was talking to. He brought me coffee on the second day of the conference. He remembered I took it black. By the third day we were having dinner. By the end of the year we were engaged. My mother didn't love him. She didn't say it directly because she wasn't that kind of mother, but I could read her. She asked me once over Sunday brunch if I was sure he was interested in me or interested in what I was going to inherit. I told her not to be ridiculous. She said, "I hope I am being ridiculous, sweetheart. I really do." We got married 8 months before her diagnosis. Marshall left his job and joined Brennick as a vice president of business development, a role I created for him. He was good at the work. I'm not going to pretend he wasn't. He had a real instinct for closing deals, and the warehouse guys liked him, and the clients liked him, and for the first year of our marriage I thought, see, Mom was wrong, he's an asset. Then she died, and I inherited the company, and Marshall changed. Not all at once. I want to be specific about this because women keep writing to me asking how they're supposed to spot it, and the truth is you almost can't because it happens by degrees. The first thing was that he started taking meetings I should have been in. He'd say, "Honey, you're still grieving, let me handle it." Then it was, "The board is worried about how visible you are right now. Why don't you focus on operations?" Then he hired a new executive assistant, a woman named Cassie, who started rerouting my emails. Then he convinced me that I should stop attending the quarterly client dinners because, in his words, I come across better as the sole authority figure. It confuses the clients to see 2 of us up there. By the time we were 3 years in, I had been quietly walked out of every external-facing role at the company my mother had built. Internally, I still ran operations. I knew every warehouse manager by name, every truck route, every contract renewal date. But to anyone outside the building, Marshall was Brennick Logistics. And he started introducing me as his wife, not his partner, not his colleague, his wife. Then the office decoration, Then, at a holiday party in front of a regional manager from Target, the prettiest spreadsheet in the building, I laughed. I want to repeat that. I laughed every single time because the alternative was making a scene in front of people who'd known my mother, and I couldn't bring myself to do it. I thought I was being gracious. I was being a coward. The morning I started paying attention was a Tuesday in February of last year. Marshall was in Dallas for a conference. I was in his office looking for a flash drive he'd asked me to overnight to him, and I opened the wrong drawer. There was a folder. Just a regular manila folder, no label. Inside were photocopies of 3 documents. The first was a draft of a press release announcing his appointment as Chief Executive Officer of Brennick Logistics, which would have been news to me since I was the CEO. The second was an email from a corporate attorney I didn't recognize, walking him through how he might structure a graceful ownership transition using something called a marital asset reclassification. The third was a printout of a hotel reservation in Nashville, his hometown, for the weekend he'd told me he was visiting his mother. It was a suite. There were 2 names on it. Mine wasn't one of them. I sat in his chair and I read those 3 pages 4 times. I remember the feeling very specifically. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness, not yet. It was a kind of cold settling into my chest, the way water settles when you turn off the tap. I thought, oh, there you are. There's the thing my mother saw 4 years before I did. I put the folder back exactly where I'd found it. I took the flash drive he'd actually asked for. I overnighted it. I went home and made dinner and waited up for him to call from his hotel, and when he called I asked him how the conference was going, and he told me Dallas was boring and he missed me, and I said I missed him too. Then I started keeping records. I want to skip ahead a little because the next 8 months are not the most interesting part of this story, but they're the part that mattered. I didn't confront him. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. I didn't call my best friend, my college roommate Priya, who would have told me to burn his car. I didn't tell anyone. What I did was hire a forensic accountant. Her name was Tomoko, and she came recommended by a woman on the board of my mother's foundation who I trusted with my life. Tomoko's office was in a converted brownstone in Lincoln Park, and she charged $600 an hour, and she was worth every penny. I gave her 3 years of company financial records and asked her to find anything unusual. She found a lot. There was a vendor called Magnolia Strategic Consulting, registered in Tennessee, that had been billing Brennick Logistics for executive coaching services at a rate of $14,000 a month for 2.5 years. The sole proprietor was a woman named Bethany Voss. The address on her business license was the same address as the Nashville hotel suite. There was a side fund Marshall had quietly opened under the company's umbrella, ostensibly for client entertainment, that had paid for 2 trips to Cabo, a lease on a Range Rover that was not registered to either of us, and approximately $41,000 of jewelry from a boutique in Belmead. There was a draft contract, never executed, that would have transferred the building lease at our headquarters from Brennick Logistics to a new entity called ML Holdings, LLC. The ML Holdings, LLC, stood for Marshall Lassiter. He'd registered it in Delaware 6 months after my mother's funeral. I want to be careful here because I don't want this to come across as a thriller. It wasn't. It was 8 months of me coming home from work and eating dinner across from a man who was robbing me, and smiling and asking him about his day, and going upstairs to a private email account I'd created on a separate laptop and forwarding documents to my attorney. My attorney's name was Whitney. She'd been my mother's attorney for the last 15 years of her life, and she'd handled my mother's estate, and she knew every clause of every founding document of Brennick Logistics because she'd written most of them herself. The first time I met with her about Marshall, she didn't say I told you so. She didn't even act surprised. She listened to me lay out what Tomoko had found, and then she said, "Okay, what do you want?" I thought about it for a long time before I answered. The honest answer was that I wanted my mother back. I wanted to be 28 again before any of this. I wanted Marshall to have been the man I thought I'd married. What I said out loud was, I want him out. Out of the company, out of the marriage, out of the house, and I don't want him to see it coming. Whitney nodded once and said, "Then we have work to do." The plan took 5 months to put together. I'm going to summarize because the legal mechanics are dense, but the outline was this. File for divorce in Illinois on grounds of adultery, with the financial documentation backing it up. Simultaneously have the board approve a restructuring that formally removed Marshall from his executive role. Cancel his employment contract for cause based on the misappropriated funds, and serve him with all of it in public, in a way he could not spin and could not stop. The in public part wasn't strictly necessary. Whitney told me that. We could have done it all by certified mail and a quiet board meeting on a Friday afternoon. But there was a particular meeting on the calendar that I wanted to use, and once I explained it to her, she agreed. It was a presentation. The biggest one we'd had in 2 years. A national home goods retailer based in Minnesota, the kind of contract that would have added $30 million a year to our top line, was sending their entire procurement team to our Chicago headquarters for a final pitch. Marshall had been preparing for it for months. He'd made it very clear in front of the senior team that this was his deal and that I would be there in a supporting capacity. I told him I'd handle the refreshments. The morning of the meeting, I wore a navy blue suit my mother had bought me for my 30th birthday. I remember she'd said when she handed me the bag, "This is a suit for the day, you stop apologizing." I'd never had a reason to wear it. It still fit. The meeting was at 10. The conference room was on the 8th floor, the one with the windows that looked east toward the lake. Marshall was already in there when I arrived, going over slides with our marketing director, a woman named Renata, who had been quietly helping me for 4 months, and who, that morning, gave me a single nod when I walked in. The clients arrived at 5 minutes to 10. There were 7 of them. The lead procurement officer was a woman in her 60s named Constance, who'd been in the industry for 40 years and who, it turned out, had known my mother. I didn't know that until later. Marshall did his thing. He shook hands. He turned on the Tennessee accent. He made a joke about the Chicago weather. He gestured at me and said, "And this is my wife, who keeps me organized. Honey, would you mind getting everyone some coffee before we get started?" I smiled. I went to the credenza in the back of the room. I poured 7 cups of coffee. I added cream to 2 of them and sugar to 1, exactly the way they'd told the receptionist they took it, and I brought them around the table. Marshall watched me, and I could see him enjoying it. I could see him thinking, this is the version of her I built. I sat down at the end of the table near the door. He started the presentation. He was good. I want to be fair about that. He'd worked hard on it and he knew the material. He talked about Brennick Logistics' history, our market position, our service guarantees. He used the word "we" a lot. He used the phrase "my company" twice. About 15 minutes in, Constance, the lead from Minnesota, set down her pen and said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. Mr. Lassiter, can I ask a clarifying question?" Marshall said, "Of course." She said, "When you say 'my company,' what is your equity position exactly?" There was a small pause. Marshall recovered well. He smiled and said, "Well, in any marriage, what's mine is hers and what's hers is mine, isn't it? My wife and I built this together." Constance looked at me. Then she looked back at him. She said, "I see, because the documents your office sent us last week, the ones we needed for our compliance review, list a single shareholder of record and it isn't you." The room went very quiet. I watched Marshall's face do something I'd never seen it do. The charm slid off it like water off glass. I stood up. I want to tell you exactly what I said because I've replayed it enough times to remember every word. I said, "Constance, I apologize for the confusion. Marshall hasn't been entirely accurate about his role here. My name is Catherine Brennick. I'm the founder's daughter. I'm the CEO of Record, the sole shareholder, and the person who'll actually be signing your contract if we get to that point. Marshall is a vice president of business development, or he was, as of 9 o'clock this morning." I walked over to where Whitney was waiting, just outside the conference room door. She'd been there the whole time. She handed me a folder. I walked back to the table and set it down in front of Marshall. I said, "These are your termination papers. They're effective immediately. There's also a separate envelope for divorce proceedings which were filed in Cook County yesterday afternoon. The grounds are documented in the second folder, which you can read at your leisure, although I think you'll find it familiar reading." He didn't say anything. His mouth was open a little. I turned back to Constance. I said, "I'd like to apologize for using your meeting this way. I won't pretend it was the most professional thing I've ever done. If you'd like to reschedule, I completely understand. If you'd like to continue, I can walk you through our proposal myself. I wrote most of it." Constance looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, and I will never forget this as long as I live, "Catherine, I worked with your mother on the Sears contract in 1994. She would have done exactly the same thing." "Please continue." Marshall got up. Whitney was still in the doorway, and behind her was Renata, and behind Renata was the head of building security, a man named Ed who'd been with the company for 19 years and who had loved my mother. Marshall didn't say anything to me. He just walked out. Ed walked out behind him. I gave the rest of the presentation. We won the contract. I want to say that not because it was the most important part, but because some of you will want to know. The Minnesota deal closed 3 weeks later at a higher margin than Marshall had quoted, because Constance and I rewrote the terms together over the following month, and she turned out to be one of the sharpest negotiators I'd ever worked with. She retired last year. We still have lunch when she's in town. The aftermath was less cinematic than the meeting. Most of these things are. Marshall hired a lawyer who tried, for about 6 weeks, to argue that my mother's estate had been improperly structured and that he was entitled to a share of company assets. Whitney dismantled that argument in a single deposition. He tried to argue that the funds Tomoko had documented were legitimate business expenses. The IRS disagreed. He ended up settling for a fraction of what he demanded, and by the time the divorce was final, he'd moved back to Tennessee. The woman from Magnolia Strategic Consulting, Bethany, broke up with him within the year. I heard about it from a mutual acquaintance. I didn't feel anything in particular when I heard. The harder part was the house. We'd bought it together, although I'd put up the down payment from money my mother left me. There was a built-in bookshelf in the den that he'd installed himself. One of the few things he ever actually built with his hands. And for the first 6 months after he moved out, I couldn't go into that room. I ate dinner at the kitchen counter. I worked from the dining room. I closed the door to the den and pretended it wasn't there. A woman in my book club, a friend of my mother's named Doreen, came over one Saturday and sat with me on the kitchen floor and said, "Honey, you're letting him keep that room. That's the last room he has in your life. You need to take it back." So we did. She helped me pull every shelf off the wall. We patched the holes. I painted it the color my mother's office had been when I was little, a kind of pale green that looks gray in the morning. It's my reading room now. There's a chair by the window and a stack of books on the floor and a framed photo of my mother on the wall above the chair. She's 29 in the photo. She's standing in front of the first warehouse Brennick ever leased, holding a clipboard and squinting into the sun. I want to talk about what happened at work after, because the comments on stories like mine always ask. I didn't fire anyone. Marshall had hired. I sat down with each of them individually over the course of 2 weeks and asked them what they wanted their career to look like. Some of them stayed. Some of them left. Cassie, the executive assistant who'd been rerouting my emails, resigned the Monday after the meeting. I let her. I didn't fight her severance. She was young, and I think she'd been told a story by Marshall that she believed, and I didn't have the energy to be cruel. Renata, the marketing director who'd helped me, is now my chief operating officer. The young woman she mentored, a logistics analyst named Jada, just finished her MBA on a scholarship the company endowed in my mother's name. There's a program now, the Brennick Forward Fellowship, that pays for women in supply chain to go back to school. We've put 11 women through it so far. 2 of them work for me. I'm 41 this year. It's been a little over a year since the meeting. The company had its strongest revenue quarter in its history last spring. I'm not telling you that to brag. I'm telling you because I know how these stories sound when you're the one in the middle of them, and you're reading something like this on your phone in your own kitchen, and you're wondering whether the woman you used to be is still in there somewhere. I want you to know she is. I didn't know she was still in me. I'd let her go quiet for a long time. The morning of the meeting, putting on the navy blue suit my mother had given me, I looked in the mirror and I didn't recognize the woman looking back. And then I did, and then I cried for about 90 seconds, and then I went to work. People ask me what I'd say to my younger self. The version of me who laughed at the office decoration joke in the lobby with the green marble floor. I don't know. I don't think she would have listened. I don't think any of us listen until we're ready. What I'd say to the woman reading this, the one who recognizes a piece of her own life in mine, is that the documents are on your side. The legal record is on your side. The truth of who built what, and when, and with what money, doesn't go away just because someone louder than you started telling a different story over the top of it. I keep a copy of my mother's will in the bottom drawer of my desk. I don't read it often. But sometimes, on days when a client or a vendor or a man on a podcast tries to talk over me, I open the drawer and I look at it. There's a line near the end in her handwriting that says, "Catherine, you already know how to do this. Trust yourself, Mum." She was right. I already knew. I just had to stop apologizing for it. I think about that morning in the lobby a lot, the green marble floor, the laugh, the way I poured the coffee and smiled at a man who just called me a piece of furniture in front of a stranger. I think about how easy it was to do and how that ease was the most dangerous thing in my life, and I didn't even know it. What I've come to understand is that nothing in my story happened by accident. Marshall didn't wake up one morning and decide to take my company. He just kept being given small permissions, and I kept giving them, and each one made the next one easier. I let him take the meetings. I let him take the introductions. I let him take the title in everyone's mouth, even though it was never on any document. By the time he was forging press releases in a desk drawer, he wasn't stealing from me. He was finishing what I'd started. That's the part nobody likes to say out loud. The cause was him, but the conditions were mine. I kept the keys to my mother's life work and I handed them, one by one, to a man who told me in 100 small ways exactly what he intended to do with them. My mother saw it at brunch 4 years before I did. The truth was always there. I just didn't have the strength to look at it. I want to talk about strength because I think we get it wrong. Strength is not what I did in that conference room. Strength was what Tomoko did and Whitney did and what my mother did when she was 31 and divorced and making cold calls in a duplex in Evanston. Strength is the 8 months of eating dinner across from a man who was robbing me, smiling and going upstairs to send one more email to my attorney. The room with the navy blue suit was just a Tuesday. The strength was the patience that built the Tuesday. And patience needs character to hold it up. If I had been a different woman, a louder one, I would have thrown a glass at his head the day I found the folder. I would have felt powerful for an hour, and then I would have lost the company, the decision to be quiet, to be precise, to use my mind instead of my hurt. That was the part of me my mother had been trying to grow since I was small. She wasn't teaching me to be a CEO, she was teaching me to be a person who could be trusted with one. So if you're reading this in your own kitchen tonight, and you recognize a piece of yourself in the woman pouring the coffee, here is what I want you to take from my story. Don't trust the version of you who laughs along. Trust the version of you who notices. The first one is trying to keep the peace. The second one is trying to keep you. Build the documents. Keep the records. Don't apologize for what you already know. The truth of who built what doesn't go away. You just have to be brave enough and patient enough to put it back on the table. I already knew, I just had to stop apologizing for it.